The gun was already in his hand when Pearl Lawson stopped being afraid. That was the strangest part of it, stranger than the blood on his knuckles, stranger than the way the kerosene lamp threw shadows across his ruined face, stranger even than the fact that she had not run when every sane instinct told her she should. She stood in the doorway of the broken-down ranch house outside of Redemption, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, with the wind howling through the gaps in the siding, and she looked at Edwin Keating holding that revolver like it weighed the same as his entire life, and she felt nothing except bone-deep exhaustion. "Put it down," she said. Her voice came out flat. Not commanding, not frightened. Flat as the scrubland behind her. Flat as the 3 years she had spent surviving things that ought to have broken her. Edwin did not put it down. His hand was trembling. Not because he was afraid of her, she understood that much about him already after only 6 weeks in this town. He was trembling because he was trying to hold something inside himself together and failing at it in real time, right in front of her eyes. "You need to leave, Miss Lawson," he said. His voice was low and wrecked like a church bell cracked down the center. "You need to walk out that door and not come back." "I know about Clarence," she said. The lamp guttered. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Pearl had ever heard. Edwin's jaw tightened. The knuckles on his gun hand went from white to bone. "Who told you?" It was not even a question. It came out with the punctuation of a man who had already resigned himself to the worst version of every answer. "Doesn't matter who told me," Pearl said. "What matters is that whatever you're planning to do with that gun tonight, it is not going to fix what Clarence Dodd did. And you know that. Somewhere underneath all of that darkness you are carrying around, Edwin Keating, you know that." He stared at her. The trembling got worse, and then it stopped entirely, which was somehow more frightening than the trembling had been. He lowered the revolver slowly, and when it reached his side his fingers opened, and he let it fall to the floorboards with a sound like a door slamming shut on something that could not be reopened. And then he sat down on the floor of that ruined house and put his face in his hands, and Pearl Lawson, who was too tired to be frightened, crossed the room and sat down beside him, because she was also too tired to pretend that she did not care. That was how it began. Or rather, that was how it almost ended before it could begin properly. To understand what brought them to that room on that October night in 1882, you have to go back 6 weeks. To the afternoon, a stagecoach pulled into the dried mud main street of Redemption and deposited Pearl Lawson into the worst and most important chapter of her life. Pearl was 27 years old when she arrived in Redemption, and she carried herself like a woman who had learned the hard way that the world did not reward softness. She was not hard. There is a difference between a woman who has been shaped by difficulty and a woman who has been destroyed by it. Pearl had been shaped. She was lean and dark-haired and had eyes the color of strong coffee, and she wore a plain gray dress that had been washed so many times it had faded at the elbows and hem. She had $17 in a small leather purse tucked into her traveling bag, a letter of introduction from a pastor in Abilene, and no illusions whatsoever about what awaited her. She had come to Redemption because she had answered an advertisement. That was the plain and graceless truth of it. An advertisement in the Abilene Weekly Reflector, 3 columns over from a notice about cattle prices, had asked for a schoolteacher willing to relocate to the western portion of Texas to serve a growing community in need. Reasonable board and lodging provided. References required. Inquire in care of Mr. Samuel Briggs, Redemption, Presidio County, Texas. Pearl had been a schoolteacher in Abilene for 2 years. Before that she had been a schoolteacher in a small farming town in Kansas, and before that she had spent 18 months nursing her mother through a long and unkind illness, while her father slowly drank the family's remaining money into the earth. Her mother had died in the spring of 1879. Her father had followed her 18 months after, less from grief than from the cumulative effects of too much whiskey and too little attention to his own health. Pearl had buried both of them, sold the house, paid the debts, and started over from essentially nothing, because that was what you did when you were a woman alone in 1879, and the only alternative was dependence on the charity of people who would expect something in return for it. She was not running away from Abilene, exactly. She was running towards something. The problem was she did not know what that something was, and so she kept moving. And when the advertisement caught her eye, it struck her not as an opportunity so much as a direction. Sometimes a direction was enough. Redemption was smaller than the advertisement had implied. It sat in a shallow depression between low, scrubby hills, the kind of Texas landscape that looks like it has been arguing with the sky for 1,000 years and has largely lost. There was a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a small hotel that also served as the post office, a saloon with a sagging front porch, a Baptist church that needed paint, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings that spread unevenly from this central spine like a badly planned garden. The population was perhaps 200 people if you counted generously, and Pearl noted when she stepped off the stagecoach that the faces watching her arrival were the faces of people who did not have very much happening and were therefore extraordinarily interested in her. Samuel Briggs was a stout, earnest man of 50 with a sun-cracked face and honest eyes who shook her hand firmly and apologized for the state of the schoolhouse, which had been damaged in a windstorm the previous spring and had only been partly repaired. He showed her to the room he had arranged for her at the hotel, which was clean and spare, and no worse than rooms she had slept in before, and he introduced her to his wife Clara, who was small and brisk, and immediately practical in the way of women who have lived in difficult places for a long time and have made their peace with the difficulty. Pearl liked Clara Briggs within 10 minutes. She reserved judgment on everything else. It was Clara who first mentioned Edwin Keating, on Pearl's second evening in Redemption, over a supper of salt pork and dried beans and cornbread that was better than it had any right to be given the circumstances. "There is a man you will encounter," Clara said, in the tone of a woman carefully constructing a sentence. "He is called Edwin Keating. He owns the Keating Ranch, which is the largest spread in this part of the county. He is also the man who donated the land and the lumber for the schoolhouse, so he has an interest in the school's success, and he will likely come to introduce himself." "He sounds like an important man in the community," Pearl said. Clara set down her fork with more precision than the gesture required. "He is an important man," she said. "He is also a man who has had significant misfortune and who has consequently become somewhat withdrawn. He was different before. Most people here will tell you that if you ask them." Pearl did not ask Clara to elaborate, because she had learned that in small towns you collected information at the pace the town allowed, and pushing too hard too fast made people close up like desert flowers in the midday heat. But she filed the information away. She saw Edwin Keating for the first time 3 days after her arrival, from across the main street, and she would later admit to herself that her first impression of him was that he was the most visibly burdened man she had ever seen. He was perhaps 32 or 33 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years of outdoor work. He wore a dark coat over a collarless shirt and a hat that shadowed his face, and he moved with the deliberate care of a man navigating a world he did not fully trust. He was not unattractive, or rather, he would not have been, Pearl thought, if he had not been wearing his suffering so plainly on every line of his body. He looked up and saw her looking at him, and for a moment they simply regarded each other across the dusty street, and then he looked away first and walked on, and Pearl went about her business and told herself firmly that she was in Redemption to teach children arithmetic and reading, not to solve the mysteries of broken men. She held to this resolution for approximately 2 weeks. The schoolhouse had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Pearl threw herself into the work with the focused energy of a person who uses occupation as a defense against introspection. She repaired the damage to the primer books herself. She organized the schoolroom, got the iron stove working properly, wrote a list of requests to Samuel Briggs for additional supplies, and within a week had established enough of a routine that the children began arriving on time, which in Pearl's experience was always the first real indicator of whether a school was going to work. It was during the second week that Edwin Keating came to the schoolhouse. He came in the late afternoon, when the children had gone home, and Pearl was erasing the day's work from the small chalkboard she had hung on the wall. She heard the door and turned, and he was standing in the doorframe with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she could not immediately classify. It was not unfriendly. It was also not quite comfortable. "Miss Lawson," he said, "my name is Edwin Keating. I wanted to introduce myself. I have been meaning to come by since you arrived." "Mr. Keating," she said, "I have been hoping to thank you. Mrs. Briggs told me about the land and the lumber." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite discomfort, but it was close to it. "The children need a school," he said. That seemed like a plain enough fact. "It is," Pearl agreed. "Sit down if you like. I have just been about to clean up for the evening." He sat, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to decline. He sat in the largest of the student chairs, which was still too small for him, and held his hat on his knee and looked around the schoolroom with an expression that Pearl slowly identified as something like carefully contained hunger. Not for her, not yet, but for the room itself and what it represented, the maps on the wall and the books on the shelf and the clean, simple order of a place dedicated to learning. "You've made improvements," he said. "There is still a great deal to do," she said. "The stovepipe will need to be checked before winter. 2 of the window frames need resealing, and I would very much like another set of primers because the existing ones are badly worn, and 3 of my students are at the point where they need more advanced reading material than I currently have." He looked at her with an attention that was direct without being intrusive. "I will see to it," he said. "Mr. Keating, you have already donated more than—" "I will see to it," he said again, with a quiet definiteness that was not rude but was also not negotiable. He stood and put his hat back on. "Good evening, Miss Lawson." He was gone before she could form a response. Pearl stood in the empty schoolroom for a long moment, and then she shook her head and went about the business of locking up. The primers arrived 3 days later, a crate of them, along with the sealant for the window frames and a note from Edwin that said only, "The stovepipe inspection will be arranged for Thursday morning. E. Keating." Pearl wrote him a formal note of thanks via Samuel Briggs, because that was the appropriate channel, and she thought that would be the extent of their dealings for some time. She was wrong about this. He came back to the schoolhouse the following week, and the week after that. He did not come during school hours, always in the late afternoon, always briefly, always with some practical purpose. He came once to check the stovepipe himself when the man he had arranged for canceled. He came once to deliver a volume of geography that he said he had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio. He came once, and this was the time that made Pearl pay more careful attention, simply because he had been passing and seen the lamp still lit late in the evening and had stopped to make sure everything was all right. "It is perfectly all right," she told him, standing in the doorway with a mug of tea. "I sometimes work late. The quiet is useful." He stood on the step below hers, which put them at approximately the same eye level, and he looked at her with that same quality of contained attention that she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things he found worth looking at. "Do you find it lonely?" he asked. "Redemption, I mean. I imagine it's smaller than what you're accustomed to." "I have lived in small places before," Pearl said. "Loneliness is not a function of geography, in my experience." Something about this answer interested him. She could see it in the slight change around his eyes. "No," he said, "I suppose it's not. Do you find it lonely?" She asked, and then immediately wondered if she had overstepped, because the question was more direct than the conversation had been. But he did not retreat from it. He considered it for a moment with the same careful seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "Yes," he said, "more than I used to." He said good night and walked away into the dark, and Pearl went back inside and stared at her papers and found that she could not concentrate. It was Clara Briggs who finally told Pearl the full story of Edwin Keating, on a Sunday afternoon in late September when the two of them were sitting on the Briggs' front porch with a pot of tea between them, watching the shadows lengthen across the scrubland. Clara did not offer the story unprompted. Pearl had by then been in redemption long enough that asking a careful question was no longer overstepping. "Tell me about Mr. Keating," Pearl said. "Tell me what happened to him." Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke steadily, like a woman who has thought about the right way to tell a hard story and has found it. Edwin Keating had come to this part of Texas in 1874, when he was 23 years old, with his older brother Marcus and Marcus's wife, Eliza. They had taken up land in the county and built the ranch over several years of extraordinary work, the kind of work that breaks most people and forges the rest. By 1878, the Keating Ranch was one of the most prosperous operations in the region, running several hundred head of cattle and employing a dozen men. Marcus and Eliza had two small children. Edwin was the younger brother, the one who had not yet found himself a wife, who was content to build and work and leave the domestic part of life to his brother's household. Clarence Dodd was a land speculator and sometime cattle dealer who operated out of El Paso and had been making moves into Presidio County for several years. He was a man of a specific and recognizable type in that era, outwardly respectable, capable of charm when charm served his purpose, but with a core of ruthlessness that he kept covered just below the presentable surface. In 1879, he began a campaign to acquire land in the county, and the Keating Ranch was the centerpiece of what he wanted, because it sat on the best water rights in the region, and whoever controlled those water rights controlled a great deal more besides. When legal pressure and financial manipulation failed to move the Keatings, Clarence Dodd escalated. Marcus Keating, who managed the business affairs of the ranch, began receiving threats. He reported them to the county sheriff, a man named Hobart who was, Clara said carefully, not an enemy of Clarence Dodd's interests. Nothing was done. The threats continued. In November of 1879, Marcus Keating was ambushed on the road between Redemption and the ranch and shot twice. He survived the first attack, but the second attack, 3 weeks later, was successful. Clara paused here and poured more tea, and Pearl sat very still. Marcus Keating died in December of 1879. He was 31 years old. His wife Eliza took her children and went back to her family in Tennessee within the month, because she was a woman alone with two small children in a place where the law would not protect her, and there was no rational reason to stay. Edwin stayed because the ranch was all he had and because, Clara said this quietly, because Edwin was the kind of man who did not leave things unfinished, even when the unfinished thing was destroying him. He had spent 3 years trying to build a legal case against Clarence Dodd. He had collected evidence. He had written letters to the Texas Rangers. He had spent money he could not entirely afford on a lawyer in Marfa. He had gotten nowhere because Clarence Dodd was careful and connected, and the evidence, while suggestive, had not been enough to move anyone to act. "And now?" Pearl asked. "And now," Clara said, "Clarence Dodd has come back to Presidio County. He arrived in town last week. He has been making it known that he intends to press his claim on the water rights through the courts, and that this time he has the legal resources to succeed." She looked at Pearl steadily. "And Edwin Keating has become, I'm afraid, Pearl. I am genuinely afraid for that man." Pearl looked out at the scrubland and thought about a man carrying 3 years of grief and rage and failed justice, and the specific danger of a person who has run out of legal options and is beginning to consider illegal ones. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She did not sleep well that night. The following day she saw Clarence Dodd for herself, and found that reality matched what she had imagined closely enough to be unpleasant. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed by the standards of Redemption, with a broad, pleasant face that could have belonged to a banker or a deacon and eyes that were calculating in the way of a man who has spent decades viewing other people, primarily as obstacles or instruments. He was having a drink at the saloon when Pearl passed it, visible through the open door, and he saw her looking and nodded as if they were old acquaintances, and Pearl looked away and kept walking and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She went to the schoolhouse and taught her classes and tried not to think about it, and that evening Edwin Keating did not come by, and somehow his absence was more troubling than his presence would have been. He came the next evening, and she could see immediately that something had changed. The careful containment she had observed in him over the previous weeks had developed a crack. He was sitting on the schoolhouse step when she came out after locking up, and he stood when he saw her, and she saw in his face something she recognized from the worst months of watching her mother die, the expression of a person who has been holding a great weight for a very long time and has reached the point where the holding itself has become the injury. "Dodd spoke to me today," he said. "I heard he was in town," Pearl said carefully. She sat on the step rather than standing, a deliberate choice, because sitting reduced the distance between them and she wanted him to feel that there was something steady in his vicinity. "What did he say?" Edwin sat back down. He was quiet for a moment. The sky behind the schoolhouse was the color of an old bruise, purple and gold and deeply tired. "He offered to settle," Edwin said. "Pay me a fair price for the water rights and let everything else go." He said it in the friendliest possible tone, the way you'd offer a man a drink. Like there was no history between us, like my brother never existed. Pearl was quiet. "He smiled at me," Edwin said. "He smiled at me the same way he smiled at the sheriff when Marcus reported the threats. The same smile. I recognized it. He knew I recognized it. And there was nothing I could do about it because I am standing in the middle of a street in front of witnesses and there is still no proof, and there will never be any proof, and he knows that too." "Edwin," Pearl said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and she noticed him notice it. "What are you considering doing?" He looked at her. His eyes were dark and direct and full of something that was not quite desperation but was very close to it. "Nothing I should be considering," he said. "Then don't consider it," she said. "It's not that simple." "I know it is not that simple. I am not telling you it is simple. I am telling you not to do it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You've known me 6 weeks. I know enough," Pearl said. "I know you built this community a school because the children needed one. I know you have spent 3 years trying to do the right thing through the right channels. I know that a man who does those things is not a man who should throw himself away on a dark road because the world has not been fair to him." He was silent for a long time. The sky completed its journey from bruise to darkness, and the first stars appeared, and the coyotes began their nightly argument somewhere out in the scrubland. "Marcus would have told me the same thing," he said at last. His voice was very quiet. "Then Marcus was a wise man," Pearl said. Edwin looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open in a way that all his previous expressions had not been, as if something had been pried slightly apart. It lasted only a moment and then he controlled it, but Pearl had seen it, and she knew she was not imagining its significance. He said good night and left, and Pearl sat on the step for a while longer, listening to the coyotes and thinking about secrets and forbidden grief, and the particular loneliness of a person who has spent years surrounded by people who care about them, but who cannot quite reach the place where the damage is. The next 2 weeks were the weeks in which everything shifted between them, though they would not have described it that way while it was happening. It happened in the accumulation of small things. Edwin began staying longer when he came by the schoolhouse. The conversations moved from practical matters to other things: Pearl's childhood in Kansas, the particular quality of prairie light that she had loved, and that she found echoed in a different register by the Texas scrubland. Edwin's early years in Georgia before the family had moved west. His brother Marcus, the way Marcus had laughed, the way he had been as a father to his 2 small children, the way Edwin still half expected to see him coming around the corner of the barn. Pearl told Edwin about her mother's long illness, and her father's slow dissolution afterward. She had not spoken of those years to anyone in a long time, and she noticed that speaking of them to Edwin did not feel like exposure. It felt like setting something down that she had been carrying for too long. He listened the way he looked at things, with his full attention, without judgment, with the steady presence of a man who understood that some things could not be fixed, and that the proper response to them was simply to bear witness. She realized somewhere during the third week of October that she was in serious danger of being in love with him, and this frightened her for approximately 2 days before she decided that she was too tired for fear. 3 years of solitude and careful management of her own heart had left her with a tiredness that went deeper than anything ordinary sleep could touch, and the idea of protecting herself from something that felt like Edwin Keating, warm, careful, honest, burdened in ways she recognized, and could speak to, seemed like an expenditure of energy she no longer had available. She also recognized the irony clearly enough to appreciate it without amusement. She had come to redemption running towards something without knowing what it was, and it turned out the something was a broken man in a dark coat who had once spent good money building a schoolhouse for children who were not his own. The crisis came from an unexpected direction, as crises in that era often did. A man named Ike Torrance, who ran cattle on a small spread northeast of town and was understood to be loosely connected to Clarence Dodd's operations, came to find Pearl on an afternoon in mid-October. He came to the schoolhouse after the children had left, and something about the way he stood in the doorway blocking it, she noted, rather than framing it, made the hairs on the back of Pearl's neck rise. "Miss Lawson," Torrance said. He was a lean, weathered man with a manner that managed to be simultaneously ingratiating and threatening, a combination Pearl had encountered before in men who wanted something and were not entirely confident they could get it by direct request. "I wonder if I might have a word." "Go ahead," Pearl said. She did not sit down. She positioned herself near the desk, which gave her the room's only alternative exit option if the window became relevant. "You've been spending time with Edwin Keating," Torrance said. "Mr. Keating donated the schoolhouse," Pearl said evenly. "He has an interest in the school's progress. That is the entirety of the matter." Torrance smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Well now, the thing is, Miss Lawson, there are certain affairs of business in this county that are coming to a resolution, and it would be a kindness to you, to Keating, to everyone involved if Keating were to have a clear head about the situation. A man who is distracted by other interests sometimes makes decisions that are not in his best interest." Pearl looked at Torrance for a long moment. The quality of her gaze must have communicated something he had not anticipated, because she saw him recalibrate slightly. "Are you suggesting," Pearl said, very quietly and clearly, "that I should discourage Mr. Keating's acquaintance for his own benefit, or are you suggesting that I should discourage it for your employer's benefit? Because those are very different suggestions, and I want to understand which one you are making." The smile went away. "I'm just having a friendly conversation," Torrance said. "Then have it with someone who finds you friendly," Pearl said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Torrance." He left. Pearl sat down carefully after he was gone and breathed with purpose for a few moments. Her hands were steady. She had not lied when she told Edwin she was too tired to be frightened. She had known it about herself for some time, this particular exhaustion with fear, this wearing through of the mechanism that was supposed to generate it. It was not bravery. It was something more complicated and less admirable, a simple running out of the capacity for certain kinds of apprehension. But she was angry. She was quite thoroughly angry, which she found both useful and clarifying. She went directly to Clara Briggs and told her about the visit. Clara's expression moved through a rapid sequence of emotions and settled on determined. "I will tell Samuel," she said. "Samuel should know this." She paused. "And Edwin should know." "Yes," Pearl said. "Edwin should know." She went to the ranch the next morning, which required borrowing the Briggs's old bay mare and riding 4 miles along a road that was more track than road in the dry western way. the kind of path that knew where it was going without being obvious about it. The Keating ranch was substantial, the evidence of years of serious work visible in the quality of the fences and the solidity of the barn and the well-maintained corral. The house itself was a long, low structure built of local stone, practical and solid, with a covered porch that ran along the front of it. Edwin was working near the barn when she rode up, and he stopped what he was doing and watched her dismount with an expression that contained both surprise and something she was beginning to read as specific to his reactions to her, a kind of careful opening, like a hand unclenching. "Miss Lawson," he said. "Pearl," she said. "You've been calling me Miss Lawson for 6 weeks, and I think we're past that." Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. "Pearl," he said, "this is unexpected. Come inside." She told him about Torrance while they sat at his kitchen table with coffee that he made quickly and without ceremony, coffee that was strong and dark and good. Edwin listened to the story of Torrance's visit with an expression that grew progressively more controlled as she spoke, which she had learned was his form of intensity rather than distance. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Then, he approached you. He came to the schoolhouse and approached you." "Yes, Pearl." His voice had a roughness in it that had not been there before. "I'm sorry. This has nothing to do with you, and he had no right." "Stop," Pearl said. "I'm not telling you this so you can apologize. I am telling you this because you need to know that Dodd is escalating, and that he or his people apparently believe your connection to me is a leverage point, and I want you to understand that it is not. They cannot use me as a leverage point unless I allow it, and I do not intend to allow it." He looked at her. The careful opening on his face had become something fuller. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. The question was genuine, not rhetorical. He truly did not understand, and his not understanding said something important about how he had come to see himself over the past 3 years. "Because you are worth doing it for," Pearl said simply. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that contains more words than either person has said out loud. Edwin looked at his coffee cup. A muscle moved in his jaw. Pearl watched him and waited because some things had to be allowed their time. "I have not been," he stopped, began again. "I have not been a person worth much lately. Since Marcus, I have been." Another pause longer. "I have been so full of this that there hasn't been room for anything else." Anger and guilt, and the particular kind of helplessness that comes from watching something unjust proceed without any recourse. It consumes. "I am aware that I have not been easy company, and that what has been visible of me in this town for 3 years is not who I am, or was. I don't always know the difference anymore." "I do," Pearl said. "I know the difference. I have been watching." He finally looked directly at her, and this time he did not control the expression. It was fully open, fully present, and it held in it everything he had been containing for a very long time, the grief and the anger and the isolation and something else, something newer, something that was specifically about her and about the 6 weeks of late afternoons at the schoolhouse and the conversations that had slowly, systematically dismantled every wall he had carefully constructed. "This is not the right time for," he began. "I know," Pearl said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I am telling you what I see. You can do with it what you choose." She finished her coffee and stood up and told him she needed to get back to town, and he walked her to where she had tied the mare and held the horse steady while she mounted, and when she looked down at him from the saddle he had his hand still on the mare's neck and his eyes were on Pearl's face. "Come back," he said. It was very simple. It was also not a simple thing. "I will," she said. She rode back to Redemption in the October morning, with the scrubland spread around her in every direction, and the sky impossibly wide overhead. And she acknowledged to herself with the same flat clarity she brought to everything that she was entirely, irreversibly in love with Edwin Keating. She was almost irritated about it. It was inconvenient and terrifying and completely right, the way the few genuinely right things in her life had always announced themselves, not with drama but with a quiet internal settling, like water finding its level. The escalation happened fast after that, the way these things do in small towns where information moves like fire in dry grass. 3 days after Pearl's visit to the ranch, the word went around that Clarence Dodd had filed papers in the district court in Marfa, pressing his claim on the water rights in Keating territory. The filing was reported to be substantial and well-funded, and the attorney Dodd had engaged was said to be one of the better ones operating out of El Paso. Edwin received the news through Samuel Briggs, who got it from the telegraph operator, and the word came to Pearl via Clara, who showed up at the schoolhouse during Pearl's lunch hour with a bowl of stew and a face full of worry. "He's been served with the court papers," Clara said. "Samuel just heard. Edwin has until the end of November to respond, or the default judgment goes to Dodd." Pearl sat with this information for a moment. "Does he have a lawyer?" "The man in Marfa he's been using has written to say he cannot take on a case of this size against the El Paso attorney. He doesn't have the resources. Samuel is trying to think of who else might help." Clara looked at Pearl. Edwin's response to the news was to ride out alone. "He has not come back to town. Samuel is worried." Pearl finished her stew and stood up. "I have to go to the ranch," she said. "Pearl," Clara said. "I know," Pearl said. "I know what I am doing." She rode out that afternoon, arriving at the Keating ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, and she found Edwin exactly where she had half expected to find him. Not on the property, but on the low hill to the west of it, sitting on the ground with his back against a rock and a revolver on his knee, and an expression that she could read only by understanding everything she had learned about him over the previous weeks. He was not going to shoot himself. She understood that clearly the moment she saw him. That was not what was happening. What was happening was that he was sitting with the last remaining option he believed he had, turning it over in his mind, holding it the way you hold a choice before you make it, because he had constructed a world in which Clarence Dodd walking away from his brother's murder without consequence was not a thing he could allow to remain true. Pearl dismounted and tied the mare to a scrub cedar and walked up the hill and sat down beside him without saying anything for a full 2 minutes. "The court papers," she said finally. 3 years, Edwin said. 3 years, and it comes down to a court filing. He's going to take the water rights. And once he has those, he'll have enough leverage to force a sale of the rest of it at his price, and my brother will have died for." He stopped. "I cannot let that stand. I cannot." "So you're sitting on a hill with a revolver," Pearl said, not accusingly, factually. "I'm thinking," he said. "I haven't decided anything." "Edwin," Pearl said. She turned to face him, sitting cross-legged on the rocky ground with the wind pulling at her hair, looking at him with no pretense and no distance. "I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it, not as advice and not as an instruction. I want you to hear it because it is true." He looked at her. "Marcus is gone," she said. "He is gone, and nothing that happens to Clarence Dodd will change that fact. Killing Dodd will not give you your brother back. It will not give those children their father back. What it will do is take you away too, either to a rope or to a lifetime of it. It will take you away from this ranch that you and your brother built together. It will take you away from this town that needs you. It will take you away from—" She stopped. He was looking at her with the full open expression, nothing controlled or contained about it, and she saw in it the recognition of what she had nearly said and had not said, and the specific pain of knowing that her not saying it was consideration for him rather than absence of truth. "From what?" he asked. His voice was quiet and careful, like a man walking toward something he was afraid to startle into flight. "From me," Pearl said. "If you need me to say it plainly, from me." The wind moved over the hill. Far below, the ranch building sat solid and real in the lengthening afternoon light, the life he had made, the life that was in danger of being sacrificed on the altar of a vengeance that even Marcus would not have asked of him. Edwin set the revolver down on the rock beside him, carefully, with deliberateness, like a man concluding a conversation he had been having with himself for 3 years and resolving it in a particular direction. "I am broken," he said. It was not self-pity. It was observation, the same flat clarity Pearl brought to her own assessments. "I want you to know that, before anything else. I am not intact. I am not the man I was before. I don't know if I can." "Edwin," Pearl said, "do you think I am intact? Do you think I have arrived here from a life of uncomplicated ease? I buried both my parents. I have been alone and moving for 3 years. I am 27 years old and the sum total of my possessions fits in a traveling bag. We are both broken. That is not a disqualification." He looked at her for a long time. The sun continued its deliberate descent. Somewhere below, a horse moved in the corral. "You are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time," Edwin said. He said it with the quiet directness of a man who does not say things he does not mean. He paused, and she saw him making the decision to be entirely honest in a way he had not allowed himself to be honest with anyone in 3 years. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second week of October," he said, "which I recognize is an absurd statement given the current circumstances, but it is true, and you have asked me not to pretend any more so." Pearl's chest did something complicated. "October the 11th, she said, "or thereabouts. That was when I realized it for myself." "We were talking about Kansas," he said. "We were talking about Prairie Light," she confirmed. "And then, on a rocky hillside outside Redemption, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, with a discarded revolver on the ground between them and a legal crisis waiting at the bottom of the hill, Edwin Keating leaned over and kissed Pearl Lawson, and Pearl kissed him back. And it was not the cautious, tentative kiss of two people feeling their way toward something uncertain. It was the kiss of two people who have both been carrying something alone for too long, and have finally, with enormous relief, set it down together. When they came apart, Pearl rested her forehead against his for a moment with her eyes closed, and he had his hand against her face, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said right then. It was Pearl who finally sat back and looked at him with practical eyes. "Now," she said, "we are going to address this legal situation. And you are going to allow people to help you, because you have been carrying this alone for too long, and there are people in Redemption who care about what happens to you and to this ranch." Edwin was looking at her with an expression that was new. Something settled and present and fundamentally different from the expression she had catalogued over the previous weeks. "You are going to organize this, aren't you?" he said. "Someone has to," Pearl said. "And you are going to let me." He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him get to a real smile, and it transformed his face in a way that made something catch in her throat. "All right," he said. They rode back to the ranch together in the last of the afternoon light. And the evening that followed was the first evening in 3 years that Edwin Keating sat at his own kitchen table and ate supper with another person, and did not feel the full weight of the world pressing down on him with every breath. Pearl ate supper at his table as though she had always belonged there, which was the most natural and most extraordinary thing, and they talked, not about Marcus or Dodd or court papers, but about small things. The children in Pearl's class, a book he had been reading, the particular quality of the stars visible from this part of Texas that had no equivalent in Georgia or Kansas. He rode with her back toward town at dark, because it was not country where a woman should ride alone at night, and they talked all the way back. And when they parted at the edge of town, there was a moment where he held her hand and neither of them wanted to let go, and then they did, because there was work to do. The next morning Pearl spoke to Samuel Briggs, and Samuel spoke to 4 other men in the community who had benefit from the Keating Ranch's operations, and over the following 3 days, a remarkable thing happened. The community of Redemption organized itself. There was, it turned out, a lawyer in the town of Marfa, a younger man named Fletcher who had studied law in Austin and had returned west because he preferred it, who had heard of the Keating situation and had been watching the Dodd operation with professional distaste for some time. Samuel Briggs had known about Fletcher but had not known that Fletcher had connections, specifically, that his former professor at the University of Texas had contacts with the Texas Rangers out of Austin, who had been monitoring Clarence Dodd's activities in 3 separate counties for over a year. This was the piece of information that changed everything. Fletcher came to redemption 10 days after Pearl's Hill conversation with Edwin, and he came not alone, but with 2 Texas Rangers who had ridden in quietly from the east. Their names were Sergeant Torres and Ranger Webb, and they were professional and thorough, and very interested in the contents of a particular strongbox that Edwin Keating had kept in the safe at the ranch. 3 years' worth of carefully collected evidence about Clarence Dodd's operations, evidence that in isolation had never been sufficient, but that combined with evidence from those other 2 counties told a story that was quite complete. Pearl sat with Edwin in Samuel Briggs's parlor while Sergeant Torres laid out what the Rangers had, and what Edwin had, and what they could now build together. And she watched Edwin's face as 3 years of isolation and failed effort were slowly recontextualized, as it became clear that he had not been struggling in vain, that the work had mattered, that the evidence he had collected with such painstaking care was the piece that made the whole thing possible. When Torres finished speaking, Edwin was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Pearl. "You went to Samuel," he said. "You were going to let them win," she said. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something more like wonder. The process that followed took 6 more weeks, because legal processes in 1882 Texas did not move quickly, and the case against Clarence Dodd was complex enough to require careful construction. But it moved with the kind of purposeful momentum that comes when the right pieces finally align. Dodd's civil filing in the district court was countered by Fletcher's representation, and the Rangers' investigation ran parallel to the civil proceedings. And in mid-December, Clarence Dodd was arrested in El Paso on charges related to his activities in 3 counties, including the circumstantial but now strongly supported evidence of his connection to the men responsible for Marcus Keating's death. He did not hang for it. The law of evidence in that era and place was imperfect, and the direct link to the hired men who had killed Marcus could not be established beyond the standard required for murder. But he was convicted on the other charges and sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary at Huntsville, and his claim on the Keating water rights was vacated when the fraudulent nature of the original filing was exposed. The Keating ranch remained intact. The water rights remained with Edwin. Pearl was grading arithmetic papers in the schoolhouse on the afternoon that Samuel Briggs brought her the news, and she sat for a moment with the papers in her lap and felt something that was not triumph exactly, but was the specific release of a weight she had not fully acknowledged carrying. That evening Edwin came to the schoolhouse, and he did not knock but simply opened the door and stood there, and Pearl looked up from her papers and saw in his face the expression she had been watching for, the full, uncomplicated release of something that had been held under enormous pressure for a very long time. He was not crying, but it was close. "It is done," he said. "I know," Pearl said. "Samuel told me." He crossed the room and she stood up, and he held her with the straightforward completeness of a man who has stopped trying to manage what he feels. And Pearl held him back with the same completeness, and neither of them said anything for quite a long time. Winter came to redemption with the particular beauty of the high desert at that season, cold, clear nights with skies full of stars, days that were bright and still, and made the landscape look like something painted in careful detail by someone who had deep opinions about ochre and gray-green. Pearl's schoolroom was warm from the newly functioning stove, and her students were, by December, reading at levels that genuinely pleased her, and the school was by all indications a success in the small but real way that things succeed when the person running them cares about the outcome. Edwin came to the schoolhouse in the evenings, as he had been doing since October, but the visits were different now. The practical pretext had been set aside. He came because he wanted to be there, and she was there, and they were both clear about what that meant. They talked for hours sometimes, or sat in comfortable parallel quiet, Pearl grading papers and Edwin reading. He was a serious reader, which she found satisfying, and they had begun lending each other books, and discussing them with a combination of enthusiasm and genuine disagreement that Pearl had never had with anyone before and found extraordinarily pleasurable. He told her more about Marcus in this period, the specific details, the texture of the person, the things he missed about his brother that had nothing to do with the ranch or the loss but were purely personal. The way Marcus had sung while he worked, badly and with no awareness of it. The way he had been with his children, patient and silly in turns. The particular quality of his laugh. Pearl received these offerings with care, understanding their significance, understanding that Edwin was doing something that grief often prevents, letting the memory of someone be whole again, rather than only the tragedy of their loss. She told him in return about her mother in the same way. Not the illness, not the dying, but the woman who had existed before and alongside all of that. The way she had smelled of lavender, the specific stories she had told, the particular piece of embroidery she had never finished that Pearl had kept folded in her traveling bag since 1879 and still kept folded there. These exchanges felt, to Pearl, like the real architecture of something. Not the crisis and the resolution and the Dodd case and the hill with the revolver. All of that was important, but it was the crisis, the circumstance. This was different. This was two people learning the shape of each other in the quiet way that shapes become permanent. On a December evening close to Christmas, Redemption had the tradition of a small community gathering at the church, carols and a shared meal, and whatever the town had managed to accumulate by way of festivity. Edwin walked Pearl back from the church through cold, clear air with the stars very bright overhead, and at the door of the hotel, he stopped and looked at her with the expression she had come to love, the full open one that no longer surprised her and still moved her every time she saw it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," Pearl said. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "I am aware that I should have." He stopped, and she saw him locate the thing he wanted to say through the accretion of other things. "This is not how I would have planned this if I had planned it. I would have planned something better. But I have learned this year that the right moment is not always the planned one, and I am standing here with you in the cold, and I want to ask you." Pearl looked at him and waited. "I want you to marry me," Edwin said. "Not because you need a home or I need someone to manage the situation. Because you are the person I want to build a life with. Because 3 months ago I was sitting on a hill with a revolver and no future, and you came up that hill and you sat down beside me and you did not pretend, and I have not pretended since, and I do not want to go back to pretending. I want this. I want you." The stars were very bright. The cold was perfectly dry, the kind that makes the air feel clean rather than harsh. Pearl stood in it and looked at Edwin Keating and felt the deep internal settling that she had learned to recognize as the signature of things that were entirely right. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He kissed her in the cold outside the hotel in Redemption, Texas, with the lights of the town visible in the windows and the sound of the church gathering still audible at a distance. And when they came apart, they were both smiling, Pearl smiling, and Edwin smiling, and it was, Pearl thought, the first time she had seen him smile fully, without the careful management of it, and it was worth having waited for. They were married in January of 1883 in the same Baptist church, with Samuel Briggs giving Pearl away because there was no one else to do it, and Samuel was both honored and thoroughly emotional about the situation. Clara was Pearl's witness and could barely contain her satisfaction at the outcome. Having watched the whole of it develop from the afternoon, the stagecoach arrived. The ceremony was attended by essentially the entire population of Redemption, because nothing brings a small town together quite like the marriage of two people it has been quietly rooting for. And the gathering afterward at the Briggs's house was warm and loud, and full of the particular kind of communal joy that small communities generate when they are at their best. Edwin's sister-in-law Eliza sent a letter from Tennessee that arrived 2 days before the wedding, having been informed by Edwin some weeks earlier. It was a good letter, warm and generous, full of the kind of language that said its writer had been hoping for something like this for some time. She included a dried flower from Marcus's grave and said she was glad. Pearl moved into the ranch house, which required some reorganization of a household that had been maintained by a man alone for 3 years, and had accordingly developed certain bachelor characteristics that Pearl addressed with cheerful efficiency, and Edwin submitted to with complete willingness, partly because the changes were genuine improvements, and partly because her presence in the house transformed it in a way that had nothing to do with domestic arrangement. The schoolhouse stayed hers. That was never in question. Edwin would not have suggested otherwise, and Pearl would have declined any alternative. She rode to school in the mornings on a good horse that Edwin had insisted on getting her, and she returned to the ranch in the afternoons, and the life they built in those early months had the quality of something growing correctly, not without difficulty, because lives never are, but with the kind of fundamental rightness that makes the difficulties navigable. The spring of 1883 brought the rains that the scrubland needed, and the Keating ranch had a good year. Edwin hired 2 additional hands and expanded his herd, and the money situation, which had been under strain from 3 years of legal effort, began to improve with the steady, satisfying trajectory that comes from competent people working hard at something they have reason to care about. Pearl's school continued to develop, and she wrote to the district about additional resources and got some of them. And by the end of the school year, 3 of her students were reading well above the level she had found them at. She told Edwin she was expecting their child on a May evening in 1883, sitting across the kitchen table from him after supper, and she said it matter-of-factly because that was how she said important things. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that traveled rapidly through surprise, and then through something much deeper and more complex, the particular emotion of a man who has lost things and knows what loss costs, and is now looking at something that is entirely the opposite of loss. He reached across the table and took her hand, and he held it for a long time, and when he finally spoke his voice was different, softer in a way that had nothing vulnerable about it. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "Perfectly well," Pearl said. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I intend to be no different." "You are never no different from anything," Edwin said, with the slight warmth in his voice that she had learned was his form of humor. "Pearl, are you happy?" She looked at their hands joined on the kitchen table and thought about Abilene and Kansas, and the years of moving and the traveling bag and the $17 and the advertisement in the newspaper and the stagecoach pulling into this dried mud town that had turned out, against every initial assessment, to be the place she had been moving toward all along. "Yes," she said, "I am genuinely, thoroughly happy." The summer of 1883 was a good one. Eliza came from Tennessee with her 2 children, Margaret, who was 7, and Thomas, who was 5, for a visit in July, and the visit lasted 3 weeks and was full of the specific complicated joy of family reconstituted after loss. Pearl and Eliza took to each other immediately, in the way of women who are both practical and perceptive, and have both navigated great difficulty without losing themselves in it. Eliza's children were curious and energetic, and they investigated the ranch with the thoroughness of small people who have been granted access to a large and interesting place, and Edwin was with them with a naturalness, an ease that told Pearl clearly how he had been as an uncle before everything broke, and told her equally clearly that some of what had been broken was healing. On the evening before Eliza and the children were due to leave, Edwin and Pearl and Eliza sat on the porch as the sky turned colors, and the children were inside where Clara, who had come out to help with the visit, was reading to them, and the 3 adults sat with the specific companionable silence of people who do not need to fill the space. "Marcus would have liked you very much," Eliza said to Pearl. "He would have thought you were exactly right for Edwin. He always said Edwin needed someone who wouldn't take any nonsense." A pause. "He also said Edwin was the better man of the 2 of them, and Marcus was honest enough that he meant it as a compliment rather than false modesty. "Edwin never talks about himself that way," Pearl said. "He wouldn't," Eliza said. "He doesn't know that's part of what makes it true." Edwin, sitting between them, looked out at the scrubland with the steady, comfortable expression Pearl now associated with the man he was when he was not in pain. "I know you're both talking about me," he said. "We are," Pearl said. "All flattering. Go back to looking at the sunset." He almost laughed. Eliza definitely laughed, and the sound of it surprised her into laughing more, and Pearl laughed too. And it was one of those moments that are complete in themselves, that contain enough to sustain memory for a long time afterward. Eliza and her children left the next morning, with plans to return the following summer and with correspondence established on both sides, and the ranch settled back into its good daily rhythms, and the months continued. Clara Briggs drove the Briggs's wagon out to the ranch in September to help Pearl when the time came, and it was a long night and a hard one, as first births tend to be, but Pearl's fundamental practicality extended to the physical as well as the emotional, and what she lacked in experience she made up in determination. Edwin spent the night outside the bedroom door, which was where Clara had put him, pacing with a quiet, concentrated terror that he did not allow to become noise, and when Clara opened the door in the early morning and told him he had a son, the expression on his face was not one Pearl could describe afterward, having seen it from the inside rather than the outside. She could only say that it was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face. The boy was named Marcus, which Edwin had asked about and Pearl had agreed to instantly, because it was right and they both knew it. He was a solid, healthy child with his mother's dark eyes and his father's broad brow, and the vocal opinions of a person who has arrived in the world with views already formed. Edwin held him with the careful wonder of a man for whom the fact of this small life was almost too large to contain in ordinary feeling, and Pearl watched them together from the bed, where Clara was insisting she remain for the time being, and felt the specific deep peace of a life arrived at. Marcus Edwin Keating was 3 months old when his father carried him to the hill west of the ranch, the same hill, the one with the rock, where the revolver had been set aside, and sat with him in the winter sunlight and talked to him about his uncle. Pearl knew because she rode up after them and sat a little distance away and listened without being intrusive, and what she heard was Edwin speaking with a directness and peace that told her that the thing between him and his brother's memory had finally reached its full resolution. Not closure, because there is no such thing as closure for genuine loss, but the kind of integration where the lost person becomes part of the living forward rather than only an anchor to the past. She rode back down before they came down, and she had supper started when Edwin came in with the baby tucked in the crook of his arm, and he looked at her over the baby's head with the expression she had come to think of as purely his, the one she had first seen fully on the hill in October, the full, open, unmanaged one, and said, "Did you follow us up there?" "Yes," Pearl said. "Were you worried?" "No," Pearl said. "I just wanted to be nearby." He came around the table and kissed her with Marcus objecting slightly at the disruption, and the three of them stood in the kitchen of the ranch house with the supper heating on the stove and the winter dark coming down outside the windows, and Pearl thought, this is the thing that does not get named. This is the thing on the other side of broken. This is what happens when two people who are too tired to pretend find each other and decide, against all the evidence of their respective histories, to stay. The years moved forward the way years do when life is working correctly, with the texture of real living, the difficulties that are manageable and the pleasures that are genuine, and the ongoing accumulation of a shared history that grows thick and particular, and entirely their own. In the spring of 1885 their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara after the woman who had fed Pearl stew at the schoolhouse and spoken careful words about a broken man, and thus, in her quiet way, set the whole thing in motion. Clara Briggs was moved beyond the capacity for speech when she was told, and Pearl counted this among the finest moments of her life. The school in Redemption continued and grew. Pearl added a second classroom in 1886, taught by a young woman named Miss Hargrove who came from Austin, and was precisely the kind of serious, capable teacher Pearl had been looking for. She continued to teach herself, because she could not imagine not teaching, but the expansion of the school meant that more children got more, and that was the purpose. Edwin expanded the ranch in a measured, sustainable way over those years, and built a reputation in the county for fair dealing that the Dodd years had not managed to destroy. He became a man that people came to for advice, and that new settlers sought out on arrival, because he knew the land and knew the water and was honest about both. He was also a man who had, in the judgment of those who had known him through the dark years, come back to himself, not the original self, because grief and time do not permit that exact return, but a version of himself that was, if anything, richer for having been through what he had been through and having come out the other side with Pearl beside him. They were sitting on the ranch house porch in the summer of 1887, on an evening that had been long and had involved a discussion with two of the hands about a fence dispute with a neighboring property that had consumed most of the afternoon. And Marcus was 4 years old and Clara was 2, and both of them were inside being put to bed by Rosaria, the woman from the town who had been helping at the ranch since little Clara's birth and had become indispensable in the way of people who are very good at what they do and very kind about it. Edwin was looking out at the scrubland with the comfortable expression Pearl associated with him at rest, and Pearl had her feet up on the porch railing and her hair down in the way she only allowed herself in the evenings, and the sky was doing the thing it did in Texas summers, the extraordinary performance of color that never became ordinary no matter how many times you watched it. "Pearl," Edwin said. Pearl said, "I have been thinking." "About the fence dispute?" "No." About a pause in the particular way he still sometimes paused before saying something important, the remnant of the old carefulness. "About whether you are happy here, in Redemption, still." Pearl turned her head to look at him. He was looking at her with the straight attention she would never tire of. "Why are you asking?" she said. "Because you came here looking for something," he said, "and you found me, and I want to make sure that I have not been an obstacle to whatever else you were looking for." Pearl looked at him for a long moment. The sky behind him was layers of crimson and gold, and the scrubland was purple in the evening light, and from inside the house she could hear Rosaria's voice and Marcus's voice, high and argumentative about going to sleep. "Edwin," Pearl said. "Yes." "I was looking for a place to belong," she said, "and a person to belong with. And work that mattered. Those are the 3 things I was looking for, whether I knew it or not when I answered the advertisement." She paused. "I have all 3. He turned back to the view, and she could see him receiving this, not with relief exactly, because he had stopped being a man who needed constant reassurance some years ago, but with the simple, clean satisfaction of someone who has been given a true answer to a real question. "Good," he said. "You are also extremely easy to be in love with," Pearl said. "For the record, I am reliably told I am not easy to be anything with," he said, with the warmth that was his form of humor. "Whoever told you that did not know you properly," Pearl said. He reached over and took her hand on the porch railing and she held his, and they sat together watching the Texas sky perform its evening work until the last light was gone and the stars were out and the night sounds had replaced the day ones, and Marcus had apparently finally conceded the argument about bedtime because the house had gone quiet. "Come inside," Edwin said. "It is getting cold." "In a minute," Pearl said. He went inside, and Pearl sat alone for another few minutes in the dark, and she thought about the stagecoach arriving in Redemption, and the woman she had been getting off it, tired, alone, accurate about the world but not yet about this particular piece of it. She thought about Clara Briggs with the pot of tea and the careful sentences. She thought about a man sitting on a schoolhouse step in the failing light, holding his hat in his hands and looking like the world was heavy. She thought about a hill and a discarded revolver and the specific moment when tiredness becomes not defeat, but freedom, freedom from the management of fear, freedom from the performance of being all right. She had been too tired to be frightened. That was still true, though the quality of the tiredness had changed. It was no longer the tiredness of someone surviving. It was the satisfying tiredness of someone living, which is an entirely different thing. She got up and went inside, into the warm house that smelled of supper and cedar, and the faint lavender she kept in a small sachet above the window. And she found Edwin in the kitchen with a lamp and a book, sitting exactly as she had found him so many evenings in the schoolhouse, and then in the ranch house, and then in the long domestic evenings of this life they had made. And she sat down across from him, and he looked up, and they looked at each other in the lamplight of the kitchen of the Keating Ranch in Redemption, Texas, in the summer of 1887, and everything that needed to be said between them was already known, and everything that needed to be resolved was resolved, and the story they were in the middle of was a good one, full of the texture of real life and the specific irreplaceable quality of two broken people who had found each other and decided that broken was not the end of anything. "What are you reading?" Pearl asked. He turned the book so she could see the cover. She had read it already. "I have opinions," she said. "I assumed you would," he said. "Tell me." And so they talked in the lamplight, while the Texas night settled around the ranch and their children slept in the next room, and the horses moved in the corral outside and the stars performed their nightly unconcerned geometry overhead. And it was ordinary and it was extraordinary and it was everything, which is to say, it was their life, freely chosen, fully inhabited, and entirely whole. And in the fall of that same year Pearl told Edwin at the kitchen table, in her characteristic matter-of-fact way, that there would be a third child in the spring. And he set down his coffee cup and came around the table and held her for a long time, just held her, and she let him, because she was not too tired for that. She had never been too tired for that. The child, a boy they named James, red-faced and emphatic and eventually possessed of a laugh exactly like Marcus Edwin Keating's, the uncle whose name he would grow up knowing, arrived on a March morning in 1888 while the scrubland outside was just beginning to think about spring, and Edwin held him the same way he had held Marcus 4 years earlier, with the same unguarded wonder, which Pearl had decided was one of the finest recurring things in her life. Watching this man hold his children and be entirely himself about it. The school had 18 students by 1888, and Pearl had plans to request a third teacher from the district by 1890. The Keating Ranch was prospering. Marcus was learning to ride with the seriousness of a 6-year-old conducting important business. Clara was 3, and already had her father's habit of direct observation, and her mother's habit of saying plainly what she saw. And on Sunday afternoons, which Edwin had long ago declared the property of no one else, no hands with questions, no neighbors with disputes, no county matters requiring attention, they rode out together into the scrubland, sometimes with the children and sometimes alone, and they were in the landscape that had been the backdrop of crisis and healing and love and loss, and the accumulation of a life that was, in every meaningful sense, what both of them had been looking for. Pearl Lawson had arrived in Redemption in the autumn of 1882 with $17 and no illusions, and a direction where a destination should have been. Edwin Keating had been sitting in the ruins of 3 years of grief and failed justice, holding the last option he believed he had, on a hill with a revolver and a world that had become too narrow to live in. She had been too tired to be frightened. He had been too broken to pretend anymore. These were not noble conditions. They were not the conditions of a story that anyone would have chosen. But they were the conditions that had put them on the same hill on the same October evening, and had led to the kitchen table and the schoolhouse evenings, and the January wedding, and the children, and the Sunday rides, and the books exchanged, and the arguments about books and the conversations that filled the lamplit evenings of the ranch house in Redemption, Texas, and all the years that stretched forward ahead of them, long and ordinary and full. Broken was not the end of anything, it turned out. It was sometimes the very beginning.